Ready. Excellent.
Wow.
Welcome back. That was a great panel. I must admit, I'm a fangirl of Ben Johnson. We've done a lot of programs together live before the pandemic here in Los Angeles, looking at the future of music in LA. We're talking about the future of all sorts of things today, and I'm extremely excited about this panel. I nudged this one together, and I really loved the people on it and the conversation, so I'm fangirling this one myself. This is session 23. It's Rethinking Space, Changing Roles of Real Estate and Single-Purpose Spaces. And I'm going to introduce the fabulous Stan Renard, and he will introduce this great panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gigi. I appreciate it. Great panel. Again, let me start by introducing everybody I have here. I have Adam Fowler, who is joining us here from LA with the Beacon Economics Group. And thank you for joining us, Adam. We have Kwende Kefentse, who is the executive director of the radio station CKCU and an artist in his own right as an underground scene DJ. And I hope that he is going to share some of his insight into that space. And finally, last but not least, Louis-Etienne Dubois, who is a prof at Ryerson University in Toronto, even though he's joining us from the great outdoors of Quebec. Thanks all for joining us. And I guess we're going to start by, and I'm Dr. Stan Renard. I live in San Antonio, Texas. So we are four folks who come from two different kind of city and economy spaces, perhaps two larger city spaces such as Toronto and LA, and two smaller, musical ecosystems such as San Antonio and Ottawa. Yes. So why don't we start with Kwende? Kwende, tell us a little bit about your scene, the work you do, and how you are. How has the pandemic changed your dynamic in the space that you work in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because where I live in Ottawa, which is the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, that's the indigenous people of this place who have stewarded it for like millennia. We here, or I should say, I guess my work here, is I've had quite a spatial practice and several spatial practices. One of them is this underground sort of, as I said, DJ performance practice, which we've been doing for about 15 years, something called Time Code. And it's something that, in the context of our conversation here, single-use spaces, we have always had our club nights in spaces that were not nightclubs, partially because we wanted to avoid that exclusive nightclub label and sort of what comes with using that kind of a single purpose space. We would always find ourselves in restaurants, in social clubs, sort of like ethnic community social clubs, Pan-African social clubs, Greek social clubs. These kinds of spaces are always sort of like the kinds of spaces that we would inhabit to be doing our work in terms of producing these events and experiences. This is a station that's been around for 45 years. And so it has a very embedded and I would say traditional spatial practice as it relates to a broadcast. So people come to the studio, people come to the station, and that's how it happens. They come to the station, they go in the studio, they push the faders, they interact with, and now, because of the pandemic, we've had to really rethink the spatial practice of broadcasting and of how we think about our organization, because really we realized how much our organization was based off of people interacting in this space. And absent that space, what is our organization? How do we modernize our operations such that we can be an organization that doesn't have that kind of spatial core? And that's something that that's something that we're gonna have to think about, even not just now in terms of the way we use our space now, but in the future as we develop new space. Because I don't think we're gonna want a kind of single purpose we're just in a radio station kind of space. We're going to want to connect it with more uses to make it more sustainable. So I'll leave it there and just sort of like to speak to those two components of the work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kwende. I appreciate it. I guess I'm going to turn to Louis-Etienne right now because he has some power outage going on, and he probably, I'm worried that, maybe his battery is not going to last much longer. So let's utilize his time while we can. So Louis-Etienne, tell us a little bit about your work, as an academic, writing about the creative ecosystem, urban development tied to maybe the venue space, as well as, what is going on in Toronto. And finally, the last piece, I know that you have one of these connected to Cirque du Soleil and that entire group in Montreal. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about insight about what's going on there as well.
Well, I mean, when it comes to Toronto, I mean, we've been working with the venue owners, venue managers for a few months now. We had this initiative that we called Lights On, in which the different partners, including the largest venue in Toronto, which is it used to be called the Sony Center. Now I believe it's the Meridian Center of the Arts for the Arts. So that's the biggest venue that we have, but also kind of smaller venues, underground venues, working with the city of Toronto as well on this. So I can tell you at the moment, not much is happening because the rules and the legislation doesn't allow for it, not even rehearsal. So a lot of the venues are effectively shut down. Many won't reopen, and they won't reopen. The pandemic was maybe the last nail in the coffin, but really those venues have been under a tremendous amount of pressure in the last few years because of a really, really hot real estate market that is looking at building more office space and condo buildings. So those smaller venues were closing to begin with, and the fear is that coming out of this pandemic, there won't be any venues left to support a thriving underground scene that is essential for that ecosystem and for emerging artists to be able to break out. So that is a big concern. The bigger venues, I mean, again, because no one is allowed within those spaces, the bigger venues are at the moment investing on HVAC systems, just developing better quality of air systems and standards. So they're using that time to rethink their space, repurpose their space, upgrade, because I mean the audience will be expecting those sort of norms and standards coming out of the pandemic. So the big ones can't afford. Again, the fear is on the small ones. And interestingly, I had this call this morning with the city of Toronto, and we're looking at is there a way that we can help some of the smaller venues by getting a better prices on these upgrades by making just a kind of bulk purchases for smaller venues, right? Because there is some government assistance, there is some government money to help those venues, but the small guys are going to have a lot of they don't have much of bargaining power and may not get a lot for their money. So that's one thing that we're looking at doing. You mentioned Cirque du Soleil, and because this is a panel on venue and space, I will just tell you this. One of the things we've been seeing at Cirque du Soleil, it's like many entertainment companies, they're extremely secretive. We have seen them over the last few months change and open up to their ecosystem. So we have seen them, for instance, open up their studios and rehearsal spaces to any circus artist in the Montreal area, which is something that Cirque has never done, right? So, just looking at these larger organizations trying to maybe move into that space of trying to help the underground or emerging artists is really, really interesting, and seeing that there is some capacity there that is underutilized and that could be put towards a better purpose. We've seen this. There's this large venue in Montreal called Place des Arts as well. So Place des Arts, it's not something that is accessible or affordable for emerging artists, but they've been also giving time and opening their doors to support smaller actors in that ecosystem. So that's interesting. So I think this is something we're going to see in the coming months and coming out of this pandemic, is that those who survived, those who had the financial means to survive, will look at ways to support their ecosystem by, again, sharing that space that they've been using for themselves for so long.
Thank you, Louis-Etienne. Let's move on to Adam. Adam, you are our economics expert here on this panel. I know that when we prepared for this talk, we talked about first the LA ecosystem, and I want you certainly to tell us about that and what's going on in your city, but also to tell us a little bit about that. That close tie in between the movie studios and the film industry and the music sector, and what has been happening there as well. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a firm that focuses on the creative economy and the ecosystems in a lot of different areas. And music and its relationship to film, digital media, other forms is really important. I think in Los Angeles, there were a lot of obstacles before the pandemic. With so many other challenges, this is another example of trends either being kind of fast forwarded or existing challenges being brought to light a little more in a little more bright way. In Los Angeles, as in many cities, we look at a lot of the kind of normal indicators. So employment, patents in these spaces, a lot of things. One of the interesting things that we have been raising a red flag about for a long time and been a little bit frustrated with the economic work done in this space is around the policy of the regulatory infrastructure. So in Los Angeles, for example, maybe we think about the Sunset Strip. The Sunset Strip had challenges where a lot of those venues, because of local regulatory structures, were making their revenue from billboards much more than music programming. We in Los Angeles, space is so important, but how we approach it is generally not very well tethered to market activity. So when we were talking about like the market around what the future of an independent radio station looks like, maybe that's you're factoring in variables around talent. What is the generational talent needs? What kind of spaces do they want to work in? What are the rental, what does the organization look like? And one of the interesting things is the regulatory infrastructure is oftentimes frozen in amber in a previous economic period. So, all the questions about gig work, that is because the systems are for a different type of work. The same thing with space is going to become very apparent very quickly. We have per capita in the United States a glut of retail compared to any other comparable GDP producing nation. In Los Angeles, we have office, we have retail, and we have very little space that is allowed to be flexible as the music environment evolves. So when restaurants are able to open, there would be challenges, right? Everybody, the restaurants were the first thing. We went through all the red tape, got them outdoors, retook the curbs. But when it came to maybe an acoustic performance, joining them, that's an entire other regulatory infrastructure that often doesn't talk to the health department, for example, in Los Angeles. What we fear is that a lot of office, mixed use, retail isn't going to be able to be adapted to the needs of the creative industries writ large, whether it's the underground scene since, the Ghost Ship fire in Oakland. The regulatory infrastructure has tried a kind of a CYA, like not my area. I'm not like when we look and see market demand for these types of events, bringing diverse voices in through those pipelines, that's a real problem, right? We're not actually making investment legal. Another example, we think about Los Angeles, you think about the heyday of Laurel Canyon and all those in-home studios. There are actually the regulatory framework around those, most of those are illegal, right? There's been a lot of good reporting on like that ecosystem is actually off the books. And oftentimes the wealthier folks that are able to invest in that home infrastructure are the ones that are able to now navigate any sort of legal challenges. So in Los Angeles and a lot of bigger cities, we need to legalize the space to bring together where the market is going. We can show all the data on Spotify subscriptions, the kind of demand side. But on the supply side, we are artificially constraining that opportunity in so many different forms. And I think it is an area that is overlooked in a lot of the data analysis around this space. You know, there's a lot of reports how to make your city the next Austin, but they don't go into the logistics. And even for the cost of nonprofits, right? Like if a city wants to do good, put some incubation space together, or nonprofit radio stations, they're still tenants. They're still commercial tenants, just like Warner Music, just like any big pocketed. And so all the money we throw at it when there is a lack of supply, it ends up going to their rent. And so we're not cultivating our bang for our public dollar is not being used in such an important way. So that's the challenge we're really thinking about working on and kind of banging that drum really hard right now. Wow.
You gave us a lot to think about here, Adam. Thank you so much for sharing that insight with us. I'm going to now. Yes,
I jump in on that
go
for a second,
ahead,
just because what Adam said is something that resonates with me. Prior to being executive director at this station, I worked as the cultural industries development officer for the city of Ottawa, doing a lot of the kind of work that Adam was talking about in terms of trying to make the connections between these different, policy, silos within the municipality to ensure that these industries are able to develop and thrive, because each of them have dynamics that, as was said, not just market dynamics in terms of consumption, but spatial dynamics as far as production. And, understanding that is a critical thing. And it's something that, in addition to sort of doing that work with the city, I also did some research it was a master's that I did it was an architecture-based master's in space syntax, which really focused on the configuration of sort of cultural ecosystems and value chains. And there are distinct spatial patterns of these, or I guess there are distinct spatial patterns of production. And without taking those into account, it's difficult to, as Adam said, maximize what's possible in terms of these resources that are in community.
Mm-hmm. Louis-Etienne, do you want to chime in on that as well?
Well, it sounds like you were going to follow up with a question, so I'll let you ask a question.
I'll do that. Okay, so we understand that part of the venue space is also the touring aspect of the business we're in, right? And quoting Kwende on this one, we're very much in a network-based industry, and so we have limitations right now for touring. How are you seeing getting beyond that limitation or dealing with it either in the short term or the longer term? How are you seeing this evolve? Let's start with Adam.
I think leveraging your resources locally is going to be very important. Touring has been a backbone. I think it's been, when folks talk about, we don't get the return on the CD sales anymore, you have to do the live production. We all know that narrative. I think looking internally as maybe like you've got to lean on your local resources, your local assets, your local talent more regularly in a period of closed community that a respiratory virus like this makes us all lean on. I think for us, again, we're beginning to think about leveraging new data, right? So when you look at the rise of Bandcamp or Spotify's data on where talent is, connecting talent to opportunities in local areas, we think is very important. Now, it's not only in like the formal kind of music space, but you think about graphic design, you think about video production, you think about a lot of the kind of creative occupations. There is a lot of opportunity in existing other industries. So if you think about the law firm that needs video and maybe some audio work done, music, some composing done for some of their online connecting those folks there that are locally, I think gives an opportunity outside of the performances that folks just aren't taking advantage of right now. When we look at the number of talented bands that are here in Los Angeles and the connections that are being made, the convening activity, we just don't see enough of it happening. And I think there's a pent-up demand for plugging those folks into opportunities in a world that we have to kind of stay local.
Awesome. Louis-Etienne.
Well, touring is an interesting one, Stan, on many levels. One of the things we were seeing before the pandemic is companies trying to, or bands, or, if I look at an organization like Cirque du Soleil, trying to optimize their routes a little bit better, right? It made little sense for a company to go from, if I just look at Allegria that last year, that went from Montreal to Toronto, then to Florida, and then I believe the next date was Boston or Chicago, right? So it's going all over the place, and there was kind of a footprint or sustainability issue behind that. Now the issue is, even if you're trying to do a little bit better in terms of touring, you may have less venues in which you can perform. You may have to compete with also, everybody else who's trying to get a date or a venue booked when things reopen. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But I can see a lot of challenges. Obviously, in Canada, touring is a big issue because, for one, our borders with the States are still closed, and look like they're going to be closed for the summer. So already we're seeing some cancellations. Big festivals, Osheaga again was canceled this week. So big events, and in part because, one, the bands can't come. Or if they come, they would have to quarantine, but then they're booked somewhere else, so that's not going to work. But two, the tourists, potential festival goers are just not allowed to come as well. So until those borders remain closed and regulations remain in full force, I don't see a lot of action or tours in Canada at least.
Awesome, thank you, Kwende.
And I think that, for me, this is something that I recall that harkens back to when I was working in government. I would always, recognizing that economic development is primarily about export-based development, and sort of like the idea of things from out, selling stuff from in here to out there. And sort of like the idea that there's more out there than there is in here. So we should be trying to orient our product towards out there. Mm-hmm. And, I was always someone who would beat the drum around local income capture based strategies, because I just saw that obviously there's a lot out there, but it's like, I always felt like, there's a real value in developing also strategies that are really targeted internally. And I think that that's where things are going to have to go for the next little bit, like really understanding local markets and developing local income capture based economic development strategies. And not only that, like just development strategies as organizations. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that will have a significant effect, obviously, as we talked about, as we said, on the way that critical components of things like space are consumed. And so,
So we just have about 5 minutes left on this panel, and since we're talking about rethinking space, I know we didn't discuss this in our warm-up call for this conversation, but since I'm listening to you guys talk, I'm thinking, what about cyberspace as a space for the work that we do? Kwende, do you want to give us your 2 bits on that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the most interesting areas for us right now as a media organization that's really rethinking ourselves and thinking about, how do we create an organization that exists in cyberspace, in a different but connected way to the way that we existed as a physical organization. We have a network of over 150 volunteers in 10 different languages, 20 different ethnicities that all sort of use this space and connected through this space. And we have to be able to find a way to do that, online in a way that is, safe, that they're not getting advertised that that it's actually a real, that we can really simulate the dynamics of convening. And that's something that, is an interesting challenge that I'm really looking forward to in the cyberspace area. And another one, just connected to that is, we talked a little bit about, one of the other values of space is the way that it captures value. And so one of the cool things about like touring is that when people come into a city, there's all this ancillary value that, they spend on hotels, they spend on all this other stuff, and the money gets spread around and so on and so forth. And so it's also about using the digital world as what ways in the digital world can we be capturing that kind of value? How can we be using the digital world to capture value for localities? So that's another thing that I'm thinking about.
Right. So Louis-Etienne, if you could chime in on that, but also in terms of, using the cyberspace and maybe not have that limit of production that perhaps the physical space has, but also the ability to scale the work that we do. Do you want to maybe share your insights into that topic?
Yeah, one of the things we've been seeing, I mean, a lot of venues have kind of repurposed themselves into these studios for virtual recording, virtual productions. Again, one thing that's happening is that those venues are not being used because you can't even be in a space to record or to rehearse. So kind of that experiment is a little bit stalled. I think moving forward, a lot of organizations or artists that experience with this format will be using it as a kind of a supplement to their other offerings, as something that they can add as an additional revenue streams in terms of business model. But I don't see it replacing or kind of just shifting where that, for instance, just the music industry, I mean, increasingly reliant on these concerts in terms of generating the bulk of their income. So I don't see it replacing it. I don't see, again, it's good. You may be able to reach some more people, but I think the audience will be looking forward to go back to a live concert and to get that experience again. If I just look not that far back for a city like Toronto, I mean, SARS didn't have much of an impact in terms of what it changed, in terms of practices on site, nor in terms of audience. So, if we manage to bounce back from SARS, I think we can bounce back from COVID. 9/11 had more of an impact in terms of security processes around the event and crowd management. So I think I'm expecting some sort of changes along those lines in terms of sanitation, the same way 9/11 had an impact in terms of security. But people are still going to be looking for that live experience. So good if they can add some virtual component to it, but not to the point of replacing it.
Awesome. Adam, do you want to chime in? We just have about a minute and a half left, so it's all yours.
Sure. I mean, I think I'll put the economist hat on. I think to make these cases, I think supplementing is going to be very important. That entrepreneurial activity is going to be really key, especially in these creative spaces. The thing is, in order to make the case to workforce development boards, to economic developers, you have to have data. And when it comes to 1099 work, contract work, self-employed work, that data is quite miserably hard to put together. So everybody will look at what the payroll numbers are. That is tethered to where your office zip code, where your check comes from. And that may not be where you're working. And I think we're pushing hard with the new administration federally in the United States to make sure that we get a better read. There are a lot of folks that have really important income streams from things like Etsy, from a lot of these music platforms. We've seen it. And that is not being folded into the formal economic development strategy. And there's a lot of entrepreneurial services in standing up those types of businesses that we need to make available to folks as they look to like supplement the old with a foot in the new.
Awesome. I want to thank you all for joining us. This was just a great, great panel. It's been a pleasure for me to get to meet all of you on a personal note. And I know that Storm has something to add to all of this. Storm.
Well, I will add, I'll echo the comment in the chat. This has been a fascinating conversation. Really great stuff here. So applause to all of you all. And thank you, Stan, for leading the panel. This is break time. We're going to go to a 10-minute break. We'll be back here at 15 till the hour. While you're out on break, and just a reminder that we do have the expo space and the people section. So spend some time networking and seeing the wares of our sponsors, etc. And we'll see you back again 15 till the hour.
Thank you, Storm.
Sure.